All right, we're going to get started here in just a minute. Let a couple more people join the broadcast. All right, I say we go ahead and kick it off. Hi, everyone. I'm Alexandra, Director of Solution Marketing at 1904 Labs. Thank you for joining us today on our virtual roundtable on getting mobile right. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, John Winsell from Arvis Bank, had an unexpected work conflict and will not be able to join us. Even so, we have a great panel with us to discuss the challenges that come with building successful mobile customer experiences. Before I turn it over to our moderator today, I'd like to go over a few quick logistical items. The session is going to be recorded. We'll be sending that recording to all registrants following the session. Everyone who's a participant is muted automatically. Please use the chat window freely though to ask questions, to comment at any time during the conversation. We'll reserve time at the end for audience Q&A. However, we want this to be an interactive discussion, so please ask questions at any time. We'll include them throughout the conversation where able. And now I am pleased to introduce Carol Aribi, our moderator for today's panel. Carol leads 1904 Labs Human-Centered Design practice. She's been a practitioner of human-centered design for more than 25 years, holds a PhD, and is co-author of several books on user-centered design. She's also consulted with companies like Google, Amazon, Wells Fargo, BJC, and a whole slew of others. So Carol, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alexandra. So thank you all for being here today. And I hope everybody is staying healthy and safe. And we appreciate your interest in mobile. And we have a couple of great panelists today to discuss all the aspects of mobile from a number of perspectives. We want to make this session as interactive as possible. So let's first talk about what we mean by mobile. First of all, mobile usage accounts for 70% of digital media time. And interestingly, you know, we think we're home now in this pandemic, but still mobile is really an overwhelming way that we interact with the companies that we work with, that the services that we consume. And mobile is becoming more and more important all the time. So it's really the go-to way for customers to engage with your brand. But as a brand and as a company, we know that it's really expensive to invest in mobile. So it's really critical to understand what to do right, how to do mobile right. And that's really the focus of this conversation today. So first, let me introduce our two panelists. First, Morgan Noel, who's a UX consultant. Morgan, give us a couple of minutes, introduce yourself, please.
Sure, hi everybody, Morgan Noel. I worked in UX for longer years than I want to admit, even not having co-authored books. I think Carol and I can recognize length in the industry, but I've also been experienced in both employee-focused work over the last few years, as well as consumer-focused work, because a lot of my background's in agency world, like Ogilvy and Mather, Leo Burnett, and then Momentum Worldwide here in St. Louis, part of McCann World Group. But previously, I've been in places like 1904 Labs, Experience Lab, and then places like that here in town. And I guess I'll stop there.
Thanks, Morgan. And next, I want to introduce Doc. We call him Doc. His Christian name is Andrew, but Doc Bell. Doc, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, I was glad to be here today and glad to be invited. I kind of wear a lot of different hats. I am the CTO of a startup called Dakota, where we're building software and new ways for substance abuse clinics to provide better outcomes. It's certainly been a crisis over the years, and it's only kind of been exacerbated as of late. So as CTO, I'm helping build out, the software side of it, supporting our mobile apps, which is really important to connect patients and therapists. I also work at 1904 Labs as an assistant practice lead for our software engineering department, and do a lot of DevOps engineering. So I really like working with big companies, see some of the challenges they have, but I also like the aspect of smaller companies as well, trying to figure out how to be responsive to change in emerging markets.
Thank you, Doc. Appreciate it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with a really broad question for Morgan and Doc. I want you guys to think about some of the best mobile solutions that you have seen, or that you have used, or that you actually helped design and develop. So from your perspective, what makes a great mobile experience? Let's start with Morgan on this one.
Well, I think we're talking UX, right? At some point, there's a lot of UX in this conversation. So for me, it always starts with the context, right? Who are you trying to reach, and what's the context in which they're interacting with your experience, right? My favorite example actually was from Momentum a few years back. Office Depot was one of our clients, and we worked with a vendor called SpiderLink, which is doing a 2D mobile code that you could do a lot of printout and control. It was branded on like a QR code. And we integrated promotion inside Office Depot's retail locations where you could snap that code, that SpiderLink code, on a banner at the back of the store. And if you won, a $20 gift card, by the time you're at the front of the store, it was integrated with the point of sale. You could actually literally get that discount by the time you're at the front of the store. So, and it worked on BlackBerry and iPhones and Androids. So it was multiple devices, all in the retail context, and integrated well enough that the satisfaction, the delight was not wait 2 weeks and get your I texted thing, or even make the text work. It was literally, you got that code back as an MMS and could use it, just scan the POS by the time you're checking out with your paper and your printer and your computers and things like that. I can also, by the way, tell you what makes a terrible mobile experience, not thinking about form factor. So
we're going to come back to that.
Oh yeah.
Because I want to give you guys a chance to talk about what's bad about an experience. So you really focused on the customer, right? And yep. How the customer interacted with the brand.
Well, don't you find that a lot of what's driving the mobilization, that's a terrible word, but the sort of mobile focused thing inside business is the fact that all the IT executives got iPhones about 4 or 5 years ago, right? So at some point, it wasn't that they were necessarily customer driven, it's that they literally became their own customers. They wanted to access Outlook and all the other productivity tools on their phones, and regardless of the fact that they were issued BlackBerries or not, they had iPhones, they liked those better, and that started to drive it to be a much more usable, productive, and frankly, not just sort of throwing a tool out there and you figure it out and get trained on it. So that made a big difference, I think, particularly about 4 or 5 years ago.
And another great point, right? So we talk about the user as one piece of the equation. You just mentioned the needs of the business as another piece of the equation. And then we have the technology as the third piece, right? So we talk about that 3-legged stool, the business, the user, and the technology. So Morgan, thank you for addressing business and user. Doc, you're a technologist. Can you fill in that third leg of the stool? What makes
Absolutely.
A great mobile experience?
Yeah. I think, even as a technologist, you still have to keep those things in mind. It's always coming back to, when you think about mobile at a high level, it's fundamentally different than web. You've got a limited amount of space. You're tapping instead of clicking. And so this starts to make you have to start to think about the user experience more so than just the functionality of the app. So things that you were able to do before, like have a hover, isn't going to have something that's going to work on a tap, on a phone device, right? It's going to be a lot harder for you to see what the content is as you hover over, and it's not going to be intuitive. So, you can have the coolest, shiniest technology, but at the end of the day, what's really important is how that actually works with the user. You have to consider things like a consistent design, right? Like a user shouldn't have to really guess at what your button does. Sure, that button might have a slick animation that happens or whatever there, but if they don't understand how that actually works, what was the point of using that new piece of technology? When you start to think about, even on a mobile experience, you want to be able to get to what you need to and the least amount of taps. Someone shared an experience using, it was an app called Hotel Tonight. And it was a really easy way to find a local hotel and book it, but it was almost too easy. Like, it was too easy to go ahead and book a reservation. They had to actually stop and think, we need to slow it down. And it's almost to like, can you push yourself to that point where it's almost too easy to do the thing that you want to do? And that's when you're starting to hit that, sort of peak of intuitive and fewest taps. And so, a lot of times, as a technologist, we want to use the shiniest technology out there. But I think there's some other considerations you bear in mind. Something that is a little bit more mature technology is going to have more support for other tools that work with it. So say you need to integrate maps into your app. A tool that's been around a bit longer is going to have more support for adding in these sorts of components. And that's going to make you so that you can move quicker. You shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel each time you need to go build maps. Like, this is a solved problem. So, kind of bearing that in mind, yes, you want to use something that is up to date, but you also have to remember that you want to be able to deliver a product. You want to be able to solve that solution quickly. And when you get feedback from a user that you need an extra thing or an extra part, you want to be able to respond to those needs quickly. And that's the most important thing at the end of the day, even from a technology standpoint, is can we get what we need into the hands to the users as fast as possible.
Terrific.
I would add, the funny thing
Yes,
about that,
go ahead, Morgan.
in terms of great apps, when Doc was talking about that, it reminded me of two of my favorite apps. They're very complementary, even though they seem like to be competitive. And for anybody who bikes or runs, you may know Strava, which can track your route, right? But if you actually do like rides around the neighborhood or go to Big Shark, they never put up a Strava map. They're always putting up a ride with GPS map. You can actually use that to build routes as opposed to just track routes. At some point, the user context, they're still using GPS, they're still tracking in a very similar way, but the actual experiences are highly different because one is actually sort of building from routes that you can either build live on the spot with ride GPS and then save, or on a desktop, whereas Strava is pretty much just a tracking app, and it's incredibly easy, start to record. I've even tracked myself mowing the lawn just to see what it looked like on a Strava app, right? And see how accurate it was. Whereas you never do the ride GPS because you're using that to build routes rather than necessarily track. So at some point, same technology, but how you're outputting it and building the experience is very different. And I will say, I've never paid for Strava, even though it's got a paid version. I've paid probably 4 years ride with GPS to build new routes. So value is a part of that conversation as well.
Well, that's a really great foundation for the rest of this discussion, right? Is making sure that it's a really positive experience for the user and that it meets those basic requirements. So if we think about, what is some of the most successful mobile apps you've worked on, kind of behind the curtain, right? What was the process by which they were created that made them successful, right? It wasn't an accident that they were successful. Something went into how they were built to make them successful. So what went right in your experience in the building of apps that made them successful? And raise your hand, Morgan or Doc, who wants to start on this one? Morgan, you're up, man.
I'll bet at some point, what I would say for mobile is probably true for almost any project that's going to integrate a bunch of different disciplines. Get everybody who's going to be connected in the room together as early as possible, right? That's typically a complaint, right? Where in agency, it happens all the time where the technologists say the creatives didn't involve us early enough, therefore we couldn't either push the envelope or tell them these things aren't doable. But it happens all the time in pure technology build as well, where somebody will have an idea in a vacuum and it's great and it gets all this accreted, moss rolling down the hill because everybody buys into the idea, and then it hits some reality of a user or something else and it just blows up, right? Or it has to be compromised so badly there was like you should have done in the first place. So I would say the first thing is, with enough understanding that everybody shares, right? What's the environment? Who's it for? What are you trying to get done? Both in terms of the experience, but also the business result. Get enough people involved early enough to at least check the boxes, right? To check feasibility, and then how big can we make it? My most successful app I've ever been involved with, by the way, was not so much a great creative idea. It's because it was, so Momentum did a lot of promotions, and we were actually built an app to support the Nabisco sponsoring the One Direction tour, when One Direction was the biggest band in the world. So at some point, our app could have been dog poop, and it still would have been incredibly successful because it was One Direction that was at the core of it, right? So when we talk about all these things, you can't forget about the content. And the content itself is going to drive probably why people interact with it in the first place, continue to interact with it, how you update that content, and why, and you know, not just the experience, but what you're experiencing inside of it, right?
Sure.
And so with One Direction, it was a tour support app. It had like these virtual backgrounds where you could take yourself with the One Direction band. So you had to create a lot of good content there. You could integrate with Instagram and publish it out and all those kind of things. So, you know, all those things you would do in a marketing context, integrating with social, but it was very content based because of who it was about and who it was for. So, and again, we had technologists, producers, creatives, and the account people and the client in the room, virtual rooms and actual rooms as early as possible, saying, we want these kind of results. This is feasible, this is not. And then we could do jump balls with vendors and integration and make timing and things like that to make sure it worked right. And by the way, immediately afterwards, working with our event producers to make sure that if we needed something on site, i.e. good connectivity in Madison Square Garden or something like that, so these things would actually work inside the event, that was also doable as well to make sure we weren't just promising a pig in the poke. So.
Thanks, Morgan. That's great. So Doc, listening to what Morgan said about, you know, multidisciplinary teams and process, as an engineer who's probably gone through, you know, I'm sure you've been on waterfall projects, you've been on agile projects. What about the process that has made the difference between what's successful and what's not successful?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things I've seen from 1904 Labs that I really appreciated was, you know, Morgan talked a little bit about getting all of the people into the room, like being included in these sorts of discussions early on as an engineer really helped establish empathy for the users that we're building for. Having worked in a process that was so far removed from what the user actually needed, there was a huge disconnect over how that they were actually going to use this software and what I was building. I can solve whatever problem you throw at me, but I need to make sure that it's the right problem and in the right order that we're doing this, and so that we can kind of grow as we build out what we're doing. And so it was a really interesting experience. You know, the software we were building wasn't necessarily very interesting. It was managing research data and sort of their workflows, and that alone can kind of bog down. You know, as an engineer, it gets repetitive or old even. But if you understand who's using it and you're getting feedback directly from them, all of a sudden you're a lot more vested in making a great product. And I think that applies to, you know, all levels of technology. And ultimately, this gets you to what the business needs too as well. So just something as simple as getting your engineers involved in this process is a great way to connect those three-legged stools there. I think from a technology standpoint, you know, one thing that I'm going to be very passionate about is being able to automate your testing and building and publishing process. And it's not just because engineers are lazy. Don't get me wrong, like, we're lazy. We don't want to do any more work than we have to. But there is a strong
I knew it. I always knew it.
Hey, you got me. I'll be the first one to admit. But there, you know, there's a strong need here. I've worked for projects where it took months to get changes in front of a user. And by the time that that's been out there, I've completely forgotten how we got to this point, all of the context around that. And so by automating this stuff, this has really made it so we can respond to those changes a lot quicker. And so, yes, that is important. You're going to hear your engineers say, we need automation, we need automation, we need automation. And it is for the benefit of everyone. And it lets you respond to changes quicker. You keep that context awareness. And it's certainly a good investment to make, and something that usually you want to do up front, and you're going to benefit in the long run.
Can I add one more thing to that? Because it has a huge technology impact when we're building. One, at this point, with the research I've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, and I've done, but also read, mobile first is in many ways a good way to start, because it's in many ways almost easier to build back to desktop or some other form factor. If you're starting from a crummy little small, oh, sorry, not easy virtual screen, like that's a small screen to do any real interaction with in a business context, right? When Doc's talking about a huge amount of data, that's not a big screen to really take big sausage fingers like mine really interact with it, right? So knowing what you're trying to get done. But I would also say connectivity comes up a lot every time we've done business implementations. I've done a lot of work in the agriculture space over the last number of years with a local company that everybody can probably guess. It's now German. And what we found a lot with people in the field, they were in literal fields, and two things happened. One, screens don't work very well in August sunlight in the middle of Illinois, but also connectivity is not great when you're in the middle of a field in the middle of Iowa or Illinois trying to get things done. So access to the data through connectivity had a huge impact on the technology build. We're going to do updates every time it had cell phone connection, what was going to be local in terms of the data that we, for speed of update, you know, how you essentially did updates, did entries, did updates to the local data was a huge impact on how you design the entire interaction. And it was more technology than it was experience. At some point, the interface looked like the interface, but the technology made all the difference in the experience, regardless of what the interface looked like. And that was huge.
So we have two things here. We have one of the attendees is raising a question. Alexandra, do you want to try address that?
Sure. I was hoping to get a little bit more information, but the question from Parth is it possible to get geolocation while the application is running in the background? So I asked for collaboration. I don't know if you guys want to address that as is.
Might be from from what Morgan was talking about as far as people in the field, farmers in the field, right?
Well, I think also geolocation, if it's in the application or in the background, I think some of it's permission based depending on the platform. On a technology level, I'm not sure how much restriction there is, but I do know there's some restrictions from a allowance and permissions level, like on the iPhone. You know, can you run the background? Do you, like even Google Maps sometimes will update in the background, but it's permission you can set or take away. And I can't remember what the default is anymore, for example. Doc, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I haven't worked with this too closely, but from my understanding, there is certain ways that you can get some of this data in the background. Some of it is going to be limited, and there's other concerns like battery life, network traffic, and those sorts of considerations as well. So it's certainly something to take a look at and see what platform you're working on and what APIs are available as far as geolocation. Obviously we have apps like Strava and some of our other apps where we can get that location data even when the app isn't necessarily up and present. So definitely take a look at your platform documentation and see what sort of API access you have there.
I've also seen. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Carol.
I'm sorry, Morgan. Just wanted to let our attendees know if you want to follow up with us afterwards, just reach out to us because we can answer more specific questions as well. Sorry, Morgan. Go ahead.
Oh no, all I was going to say is I know as it used to be more open, and people could honestly that had a lot of privacy issues. So in many ways, our market has been driven by some of the reactions in the European market, where you had things, even the 2012 Olympics, I believe, in a marketing agency in London had set up garbage cans that was doing interruptive push advertising because they were able to track on the cell tower connectivity, devices have been passing by those cans, right? As odd as that may sound. And there was a huge outcry and people felt violated by the tracking of it, honestly. So that's actually pushed back to the States in a lot of ways of how it opt in rather than opt out kind of things, depending on the app and depending on the environment. So.
Great. Well, thank you. That was a really great response to that last question. And one comment, and then we're going to move on to the next question. I just want to reflect on something that Doc said, which is that the developers, the technologists on projects are also human, right? And they want to feel like they're solving the right problem as opposed to just going off and putting their heads down and coding. So that's part of the equation that maybe we may have not thought about as much as we should have in the past, right? That the folks working on solving, the folks working on solving the problem really need to know they're doing the right thing. So thank you for that, because that was a real, a nice light bulb for me too. So let's get to the next question. So this is the Debbie Downer part, right? But this is where you get to tell your war stories, Morgan and Doc. So on the flip side of thinking of some of the least successful mobile apps you've worked on, So what about the process by which they were created made them unsuccessful? So in other words, what went wrong? So let's start with Doc on this one.
Yeah, I can think of a project that I worked on. I called that process sales-driven development. The salespeople would go to our product owner and tell him, hey, I can't make this big sale because it doesn't have feature X. And I don't want to rag on salespeople. You know, at the end of the day, they're going to relay what they're hearing from the users, but they also want to make that sale, right? And so then we get from the PO, hey, go implement feature X. And sometimes this is pretty straightforward. We get it out the door. You know, other times this ends up being a pretty big lift. You know, we spent 9 months implementing a scheduling system into a payments platform. And we agonized over, you know, how often they could set up payment, what the dates and times. If you ask any developer to talk about working with dates and times, they will cringe and go into a panic. It wasn't fun work, but at the end of the 9 months, you know, we realized that, you know, we really hadn't talked to any of the users that were going to be using this. We didn't get a lot of feedback from, you know, the sales teams or even, you know, some of the other stakeholders. And, you know, at 9 months, we went to go present this, and lo and behold, like they couldn't sell it. And it was nothing more disheartening than this actually didn't meet the needs that we wanted. And it was just a sort of breakdown between getting users involved and understanding what their real needs are. There's certainly a lot of simplifications that could have been happening there. We were way over engineering this problem because we were trying to imagine all of the different scenarios that they'd want to use this for, when in the reality was all they wanted was once a month. And that would have like changed the whole outcome there. So, you know, keeping, you know, your users involved, keeping your stakeholders engaged throughout the process. You know, I really believe in having regular check-ins with your stakeholders so they can see the incremental progress you're working on. They can see that it's moving in the right direction. And if they see something that they know isn't going to be what the business needs or what the users needs, they can say that right then and there, and you can change your direction from there. And so avoiding that sort of slog of work. And this was an agile shop. Like we were working in sprints, we were doing the cards. It was all, you know, what we could do. But the other part of that agile process is having your design, your users, your stakeholders all engaged in this. Even if your devs are agile, it doesn't mean you're going to end up with that.
Thank you, Doc. And Morgan, go ahead.
You know, obviously some of it's the flip side of what we said for successful one before, right? Not involving people early enough. So rather than go over that ground again, I think the thing I've always seen, and I'm glad Doc mentioned POs, right? So if you're talking about a product owner in that context, my bias is that if they're coming from a typical IT background in a very corporate way, which has a lot of benefits of safety, security, you know, being very regimented in a lot of ways, a lot of times success is we ship product, right? At some point it's the email empty equivalent of productivity, right? You sent something out the door, therefore you were productive. And, you know, what's your guys' phrase in 1904, right? The right thing built the right way, as opposed to just a thing built the right way, right? And at some point, we've seen all the time, you can be as agile as possible, be amazingly productive, hit all your story points, hit your velocity, and then nobody wants what you built. And what I've found is that the two processes that have worked best for me in mobile over the last 4 or 5 years for design, buy-in, everything else like that is mobile first, meaning think about from the mobile device first, and then how it backs up to the other devices, like desktop or anything else. And 2, multiple check-ins with the intended audience as early as possible and as often as possible. So again, it tells you all the things that what's going to be barriers to adoption, what are the things they really need to solve, so you're not actually wasting time building stuff they don't need, like a calendar that's overbuilt. And again, how they can actually solve their business problem rather than necessarily the technology problem, if that makes sense, right? And business problem meaning not just them as a user, users are amazingly adaptive to even badly built software. They will figure out ways through it to get their job done. What they end up doing is leaving out maybe a lot of things that were built that are crucial to being more productive or useful in a business environment. That doesn't mean they're doing it wrong. It just means that things weren't focused in the way they needed it. And I can think of, and it goes down to as simple a thing as, so my last job was at Merritt's Motivation, and they're a Microsoft shop. They're also for their sometimes when you get that login, when you're on your device, they're very good about security, but you've got this tiny little desktop screen that you're trying to type into, and it's bringing up the keyboard that's the wrong keyboard for what you're trying to type in. It doesn't have the @ sign or all those kind of things. Even those smallest little pieces of how it's integrated make a huge difference to whether or not you're successful, even completing a simple page, just type in your password and then do your double factor authentication. To the large thing of, hey, I can't even see my iPad screen in the field. Therefore, I have a picture I forgot to send you guys of a PhD who created his own little like harness to carry an iPad on his chest that had a screen to block out the sun. And it was amazing, but it was like he was, you know, and he had to also bend over to check on crops. At some point, you know, the iPad wasn't, he was the only person of about 2,000 iPads that sent out that actually got maximum productivity out of it. The only one. A lot of them just threw it in the truck and checked into it once a week because it really couldn't be usable, right? So checking with them a year before would have at least found ways to try to mitigate those problems and not necessarily solve them.
That's great. Really, it gives a bigger perspective on all the pieces of the process. And again, we go back to that three-legged stool, which is we're going to focus on in this next topic that we're going to address, right? So, you know, at 1904 Labs and elsewhere, we talk about our process as focusing on the three legs of the stool. I mentioned this earlier, right? We need to understand the business and their requirements. We need to understand the customer, the end user, and we need to understand the technology that's going to bring to bear the solution, right? So all of these things have to come together in a really seamless way. So one of the challenges is a lot of times there are trade-offs, right? So the user wants something that may not be technically feasible, or the business wants something that actually conflicts with what the user wants. So in your experience, like, what are the things that you think about when you're trying to balance those three legs of the stool: the customer, the technology, and the business? And Morgan, let's start with you this time.
Well, I'm usually customer or audience focused, but customer focused usually means I have to test. I would say I'm using the customer to figure out which one's going to be coolest, but also the largest factor in the audience, right? So at some point, especially when we're talking about a marketing sphere, iPhone was always part of it, but it was usually the smallest part of the market because there's a lot more Android phones out there, right? Was less, the APIs and the TDKs were a lot less standardized. So at some point, we'd start iPhone. We try to do things that were, frankly, as broadly applicable as possible, which meant you were using a lot of third-party apps like Google Maps, for example, that had solved some of those problems for you, right? So how much jumpstart can you get from a larger organization that's already, to some extent, tripped over the barriers that are going to trip you up? You at least hope, right? There's a downside where maybe a few years ago at STLX, Luke Robleski came in and talked about the hamburger menu and how people had adopted because Facebook had used it. So everybody assumed Facebook had tested it. They never had. They literally had to throw something out there, thought it was good enough, and people assumed, well, if Facebook does it, it must be fine. And it's a terrible interface. It doesn't fit any of the form factors or affordances you'd want to use in a good design. So they stopped using it about 3 months in their first app, but it was still such an industry standard that industry standard can still mean terrible, right? Because why was it adapted or adopted, excuse me, adapted and adopted, I guess. So at some point, you know, thinking who the customers are and what their interaction points are the first thing to balance those pieces, because you can't reach them, then the business goals can never be met, right? So the other thing that I actually think is hugely important, and that's, again, is from a marketing background, is how do the people get introduced to that mobile experience in the first place? Now, in a marketing context, you want to get them to download the app, but again, I haven't seen like in the last year, but even as recent as a year ago, there was still a stat that 80% or 90% of all apps got used once after download, and people never checked into them again, right? Because they took one look, you know, decided it wasn't for them, and never even bothered to delete it from their phone, right? Whereas I just downloaded an app for my insurance company, and because my wife had signed up for a discount, and it's literally to the point before from Parth about updating, you know, checking that geolocation in the background. It's actually American Family Insurance is checking if I'm doing distracted driving. So it has to be, am I picking up my phone and using it while I'm in the car? So it's checking movement. It's checking interaction on the accelerometer in the phone itself, but also access points. And it's doing the background. It has to be accessed in the background if I don't have the app open. And the funny thing is, it's so effective that, because it now gives me updates through all these things, that it's affecting my other mobile use. Like I'm not fast forwarding through podcasts the way I used to, because I'm worried I'm going to be getting dinged for distracted driving because I don't have a good integration on my car screen, right, through Bluetooth. I've got a old stereo that doesn't have the full CarPlay for my iPhone. And so I don't even touch my phone when I'm driving now, because I'm worried that fast forwarding past 2 minutes of ads on a podcast is going to get me dinged for my insurance discount. So, that's the other thing about balancing it, is how do you fit in terms of that customer's overall mobile ecosystem, right? What do they have on their phone? What do they use all the time? And what benefits do they get from interacting with your experience? In employee space, you get forced to a lot of stuff, right? In a consumer space, the thing this is the most frightening rule I ever had to discuss with, rule's the wrong word for it, but with customers, with clients, with people I was trying to get to be successful in a digital marketing space, was you're not fighting against your competitors in the space. What you're fighting against is indifference and people just not bothering to interact in the first place. It's not Nike versus Adidas. It's, I'm not going to buy shoes at all right now. It's too much of a pain, right? Yeah. It's no, thank you. I'm going away. I'm completely dropping off the funnel. And that's what you have to keep in mind, is if you're not as easy as pulling up Google Maps and finding directions, then why not?
So Doc, all right, I'm going to keep you on your toes here. I'm going to, so what I heard Morgan saying was, even though you have to respect the business needs and the technology, user needs always comes first. I may be oversimplifying that, but,
anyway.
but that primacy on the customer and the user is really what makes something successful or not in a consumer market, right? So if you're a technologist and you need to make sure that you're addressing the primacy of the user, how do you say, okay, this is why technology needs to be as important or as respected and foremost when you're trying to come up with a solution?
It's a difficult problem at times. And I think it's very easy to be completely ignorant of that problem too. I think, we touch back to making sure your engineers have that empathy there so they can understand what that trade-off is on, do they want to use the most cutting edge tech, or do they want to go something, a little more stable, tried and true? I guess, bluntly, I'll share on Dakota, I think one of the missteps we made as a small startup is we have an Android app, an iOS app, and a web app. There are ways you can build a progressive web app that works on all devices, can be added as an app button on your home screen, and then you've reduced your developer needs greatly and can only have to implement a feature once. There's also hybrid mobile apps that can kind of combine some of the best of both worlds. And so certainly there's some trade-offs there, but considering, especially in a startup, you want to be able to respond quickly and get features out is the most important thing. You have to get traction. That's a misstep to try to tackle all three of those things at once. Even if you start to consider a larger company, they want that app in the app store so people can see it. But sometimes you have to question, okay, is there a way we can start to validate these needs and usages before we go out and build out a full app? Can we build a progressive web app that tackles multiple needs at once? We can get into the user's hands, get that feedback, and use that as a basis to then build. And so, engineers are going to have a strong sense for what's the right tool for the job. And as long as you're keeping them engaged and helping them understand what those needs are, as opposed to the problem, they're going to be able to make that right choice and make that right recommendation. If you come to engineers and say, I need an iOS app, they're going to build you an iOS app. But if you say, I need a way for our users to be connected from their phones, and I'd like to get it out as soon as possible so we can start testing this, they're going to bring you alternatives, and they're going to help you decide what that choice is to make. I think another thing that we think about a lot on Dakota is on the reality is working with people going through substance use clinics, working through these sorts of these users. There's a wide range of demographics we have here. We have a wide range of the phones. They're not, just bluntly, they're not going to have the new iPhone 10. We need to make sure that we can support a wide range of devices and in a wide range of scenarios. So they might have limited cell phone access, no cell phone access at all, or bad internet connection. And so when we, even something as simple as like, what version of iPhone or Android should we support? As a developer, I want to support the latest and greatest, but I want to make sure that my users can actually use our application. On the flip side, we touched a little bit on this. There's a lot of security and privacy concerns. I want to make sure that there's a base level that my patient data, that people using our app, their data is safe and protected from other malicious apps. So I want to make sure that there's a baseline that I hit as well. And finding that sweet spot certainly is a hard problem. But if you engage your engineers and they understand what the business and user needs are, they're going to be able to make those recommendations and make that right choice.
Hey, Doc, do you mind if I ask a follow-up question on that? One of the things we had a lot of hard time with clients is why should it be an app when you could just have a mobile enhanced website? And at some point, if we think about Bank of America, I can log into Bank of America just as easily from Safari as I can from the app. It looks a little bit better in the app, but the functionality is almost identical. Where do you see the differences? Again, latest and greatest, that's fine, but where do you see the benefits of those two choices?
Yeah, absolutely. There are certainly features and capabilities that a native app or some alternatives like hybrids are going to have that a mobile web app or progressive web app aren't going to be able to do. We had a question earlier about geolocation. You're going to have a lot better capabilities as an actual app than a web page or a web app in those situations. So, you're not always going to know all of your needs up front. Certainly that's something you might have to pivot on at one point. But if you have a general idea of what sort of capabilities you're going to want, that can really guide that discussion. I think the other flip side, and this kind of comes back to what we've seen in Dakota, is considering your capacity. Do you have the budget to hire an iOS team and an Android team and a web team and somebody to make sure that these three teams are in alignment? You have feature parity between the three. It's not a requirement, but certainly that'll come up. If someone can use a feature on an iOS, but their partner on their Android phone can't, they're going to be upset. Both of them are going to be upset. So, that's another consideration. So speed and capabilities are going to be your big factors there.
And cost, right?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I think also point, because at some point, we were talking about the balance here. If we go back to Strava versus Ride with GPS, Strava's VC funded, and they've had years and years of problems because they're growth oriented, but nobody wants to pay for the premium services because they frankly don't bring that much extra value. Whereas a Ride with GPS is, I think, $19 a year, which is not nothing, but it's not, it's not a crazy amount, but it's more than you usually pay for an app, and people renew all the time. They have something like, I think the last I saw, something like 80% renewal once they buy in, because the services are so available and valuable enough to that audience. But their audience is much smaller than Strava because it's not a niche audience, but it's a much more focused, targeted use. And so at some point, the business balance is they're an independent company. They can be focused like that, whereas Strava's VC funded. If they don't have growth, they almost can exist to some extent, which is why they've had like 5 CEOs in the last 4 years, including back to the original leadership. So that's a huge part of it, right? What does success look like for your money people?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
And
great conversation. I just want to remind everybody, please use the chat window if you have any comments or questions. Alexandra, you were going to jump in?
Doc, related to what you were talking about in terms of some of the security considerations you've had to make with Dakota, more generally, what are some things that people should be thinking about in terms of mobile security as they're planning their mobile experiences?
Yeah, working with patient data keeps me up at night. Let's just say that. There are certainly lots of considerations that you have to make when it comes to security, even if you're not working with protected information, PII, working with credit card data, any of these sorts of things. Like at the end of the day, you don't want your big headline news story to be about your data breach, right? Like that's not how you want people to hear about your app. And just from like being a good human standpoint, like I want to make sure that your data is secure with me. We are making an agreement that in exchange for you giving me part of your data, I want to provide you value with that. I want to give you transparency into what I'm doing with that data. I want it to be able for you to see what we have about you and let you to know what we collect about you. And this kind of goes beyond, just the technology implementation standpoint. Like I can sit here and talk about end-to-end encryption and multi-tenant, security, and those sorts of things. And there's plenty of work out there. You just have to make sure you go look this out. And I think the important thing is you have to start with security in mind. Security can't be an afterthought. Some of this is so ingrained into both a standpoint of how you build the technology, but also how you make that agreement with your customer. I see the privacy clause in our apps as a two-way discussion. It needs to make it clear what you're giving up and what you're getting in return. And that is fundamental how you need to start this out with. And then from a security standpoint, you have to make sure that you are doing what you can to make sure that this data is safe. And then if something does happen, that you can try to understand what happened, who might have accessed it, what they might have accessed, so you can disclose that sort of information to you. So thinking about auditability as well as just general good practices there. Yes, it's a lot to it, but there's certainly a lot of good resources out there. OWASP is a great resource to start with if you're just starting out and want to see what information you need to have. All of the cloud providers are usually more than happy to give you resources or even have somebody do a security audit with you. I know AWS has a great program to check out. And so if you are interested in those sorts of things, there are people out there who are more than willing to help you find the right solutions. But at the end of the day, start with security.
Can I reinforce that for a second? So about
Go ahead, Morgan.
Back in 2017, I was doing an initial research project for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Kansas City for their combined health. They were building a clinic that had insurance combined with healthcare, right? So it was a new product. But one of the things they wanted to test was the comfort level of signing up online through a phone, because they knew most of their audience was going to be mobile first, maybe almost mobile only is what we discovered, right? Literally one guy said, the only reason I pull my laptop, which is under books and like coasters, is to get the keyboard. But they actually asked us to push, not just would you sign up and give your name and address and blah, blah, blah. Would you put your social security into it? Would you put your banking information into it? I mean, we pushed in some pretty secure, private piece of information, and not a single person had an issue with even entering their social security number in their phone for Blue Cross Blue Shield, right? I mean, that's a pretty high level of private information. And they were like, yeah, sure. I mean, if I was signing up for it and I knew what I was signing up for, and it was through these guys, I would do it. So to reinforce that, the expectation is they're giving you some pretty private information and you better have it handled securely. I was amazed, by the way, because I come from an older school where it's like, oh, people ghosting phones and things like that, where it's like, no, I'd go to the laptop at least for that. And they were all like, no, forget about it. I wouldn't even bother. The only thing I get the laptop out is for the keyboard. Everything else I do on my tablet or my phone.
Wow. Well, yeah, definitely. I think there are generational shifts happening too, in terms of a willingness to give away private information. I think there's some research on more the millennials and the younger generation not caring at all about giving away social security numbers and things like that. So we need to understand users not just as a monolith, but what segments of users we're going to be attracting and what their proclivities are with regard to how much trust they have and how much they're willing to give into the system. This is really great conversation. We've got a couple more questions. And again, let me remind everybody, go ahead and use the chat if you want to comment or ask a question. This next question is actually very timely. So this is on all of our minds, obviously, 24/7 these days, this pandemic, this crisis that's overwhelming us all now. And it's changed a lot about how we behave at home, how we behave at work. So what role do you see mobile playing during and after this crisis? Morgan, go ahead, you start this time.
So this is funny because you have to draw a hard line on this question between remote and mobile, right? We're all doing remote right now. Even last week, my laptop had a problem with its power source, and I had to order a new one. So I was doing some of this on a Zoom on my iPad, and the difference was night and day in terms of quality, in terms of lag time and things like that. So at some point, I think work at home is both remote and mobile at the same time. So at some point, all the factors about consumer interaction driving, business usage of mobile, I think are going to become more to the forefront. If they're terrible apps for getting your business work done, on a tablet or on a phone, it's going to have a real effect on how people are productive or actually will join companies, right? We do know that bad tools at least cause people to leave companies. In my old job when I was doing research, they aren't necessarily the reason people join, but they're certainly the reason people get frustrated and work around it and get very hateful about it, honestly. But the people driving mobile more than anything else are honestly salespeople in a business environment, and then executives. So what I think is going to happen personally is that mobile is going to expand to other devices beyond just the phone. Mobile is going to be, I think you'll have, rather than this heavy laptop I have here, a lot more of these sort of small, nimble, maybe even netbook type laptops that become sort of de facto standards that you carry around to be productive, interact with your family and friends. I mean, I wish I could still get my dad to FaceTime, but other than that, I got him on Zoom. That was a struggle, but FaceTime is just a level beyond. Whereas my mother-in-law, who's a former teacher, has been playing chess with my son using the iPad, and the only drawback is it's not exactly as easy. He can still cheat is the problem, rather than being in person. So 9-year-olds cheat at games; they just do. So at some point, I think the real role that mobile is going to play is it's going to be what I believe and what I've seen in my own personal life, but also talking to friends in various cities across the country, is seeing people, not just texting, but seeing people, talking to them, hearing their voices, seeing their faces, is going to be much more of a requirement for mobile devices, both on a personal level and a business level, and it's just going to be a new standard, right? Zoom on the phone will be as powerful, and frankly, video I think will be more of a default, rather than just, the mute on the conference call where you can't tell if somebody's listening or not, right? I think video in particular is going to be a huge driver post this crisis, and I think it has to be for connection, human connection, as well as better collaboration and productivity. Now,
that's great, Morgan. So some of the features, functionality that maybe used to be optional is going to come to the forefront.
I think so. I think if somebody can develop a virtual happy hour app that actually makes people happy, that'll be a world breaker, right?
There you go. And Doc, as a technologist, what kinds of features, functions, applications that you see are becoming more important now that we're in this situation than wasn't as important as before?
Yeah, I do want to, I've got one example I want to share that I think really sells the importance of having a streamlined process and having automation. Is as a big foodie, I've ordered a lot of food to be delivered in the last couple months here, and I've noticed that almost many of the apps have added an option to leave your food on the doorstep to respond to COVID. And from a technology perspective, this is a stupidly easy feature, right? I click a checkbox on the order screen, and the delivery driver gets a notification that says just leave the food. There's not a whole lot of work involved in that. But having been involved in projects where a change could take months to get deployed, you wouldn't be able to get this out fast enough, and people would move off of your app onto somewhere else. And the opportunity cost there from a business perspective has to be astronomical to not be able to respond to these sorts of changes. And I think that's the new reality that we're living in, is we're gonna have to be responsive to change, even more so now than we've ever been in the past. Morgan, you bring up a really good idea about how interaction is changing. For Dakota, we're working with outpatient substance abuse clinics. This revolves around face-to-face conversations with a client and therapist, and that has stopped. That they are not doing this anymore. And it's no surprise, people using our platform also completely stopped. And so they've moved to using Zoom or Skype or whatever the case is. There are plenty of options out there, but we had to pivot quickly as far as how do we respond to this change. And so now we're working on building in video into our platform so that our therapists can stay connected, have that face-to-face conversation, and have their tools that we're providing right there with them, and provide the clients an easy way to get that start that conversation. They're already going to have our app on our phones. They're going to be set up and ready to go. There's no dial-in instructions or things like that. And so, yeah, adding video to our platform wasn't the key feature. It's reinforcing what we're doing. They can find a video chat anywhere they want. But being able to respond to this change quickly is something that I'm really proud of how we're able to do this. And I think this is a case where, you know, companies should consider off-the-shelf sort of solutions. We're using a service called Twilio. They provide video and voice and text messaging. And, you know, it's really easy to make the case of, well, this is going to cost something in the long run. You know, me as a technologist, oh, I could build that. Just give me a couple weeks. But this needs to happen now. And that cost, the ongoing cost, might not be that payoff of that opportunity cost. If it takes months to get that feature built, that's months that we've gone without having this sort of ability to get traction in this new environment. So yeah, there's a trade-off. At one point, it might be more expensive to pay for Twilio to do this. But right now, the most important thing is getting this into people's hands and having, you know, technologists that are aware of what's in the market, what tools are available, and what they can piece together to build a solution, and writing code that is modular and flexible, and they can pull pieces out here and there and make what they need to make is a skill that takes time to craft and certainly pays off in these situations where you need to respond to change quickly.
That's a really great, sorry, go ahead, Morgan.
Well, Doc, you reminded me of something. I think there's two other things, especially in consumer space. Customer service is going to be a much more comprehensive discussion. Curbside pickup at Home Depot is much more pleasurable than going through Home Depot and shopping if you know what you're looking for, right? Especially since I've been doing plumbing work over the last 2 weeks and I've been to Home Depot a lot. Having not to go in, go through the aisles, just literally come in, text, it's delivered to my car is a much more satisfying experience than if I didn't know what I was looking for, different circumstance, right? But since I knew, ordered, boom, within hours I had it available, even same day. The second thing is, you were talking about grocery delivery. Well, I've got a cooler on my front porch right now for Overweiss, but when I'm not in the house anymore, when we're maybe back at the office, Amazon, I wonder how many fridges are going to be bought just for garages or in-garage delivery that Amazon provides when LiftMaster, who integrates with Amazon, for example, if you have those devices, they can have a code where they can deliver right to your refrigerator, even through their Amazon Fresh stuff, right? So at some point, when does Instacart promise in-garage delivery into your refrigerator for ice cream, not just groceries on your front porch? That's a huge factor, and that's a customer service factor that you're going to have to start to consider in all these kind of remote and mobile factors.
No, these are great. And actually, the one thing I'm taking away from this last response was speed, responsiveness, being able to pivot quickly, which actually plays into the fact that we have 2 minutes left. And so I'm going to ask you both to very quickly pivot to a 30-second response to this last question. We'll start with Morgan. What advice, like in 30 seconds worth of advice, if you're a company just getting started with mobile, they're just dipping their toes into mobile, what would be the most important things they should think about as they're getting started? So 30 seconds there, Morgan.
3 things. 1, what's the core thing you want your user to interact with you mobily, whatever that format is, text, app, web, who cares, but what do you want them to do? And then who is it? What do you want them to do? And the third thing is, what can you build without building? Like Twilio is a great example. It integrates very easily into a variety of formats, from voice call to text to whatever, but there's a lot of other vendors out there who've already pre-built a lot of these interactions. And so design for the pre-built to learn before you actually invest in building custom stuff for your customer needs, making sure it's focused as possible. And then the trade-offs are, what can I get in the market pre-built that's going to have value versus spending 6 months that will only work and maybe it isn't quite the right thing. So those 3 things: audience, interaction, pre-built.
Amazingly quick 30-second answer. Doc, you're up for 30 seconds. Go for it, man.
There's a lot of mobile developers out there. I think the key thing that you're looking for is developers that know how to be flexible. They know how to use different parts of their tools. You don't necessarily have to have an expert in everything, but somebody who can see that breadth is a key part. I think the second part, and maybe selfishly, I think you need a good DevOps engineer. You might already have operations teams or DevOps teams, but you want somebody who understands the unique needs to mobile. It's a different ballgame than what you might have been working with before, and that's something that I think gets overlooked a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys. Alexandra, wrap us up.
Well, thank you, everyone. I know we kind of ran out of time for a formal Q&A there, but if you have any other questions, feel free to enter them still in the chat window. We'll also send out a follow-up email with the recording of the session. So if you have questions afterward, feel free to reply to that and we'll get you answers back to you directly. A couple of quick items on what's next. We do have an ebook coming out that we'll share with you over email around getting mobile right on this very same topic. We do have a free mobile strategy session that you can also request in reply to that follow-up email. And we're going to be putting out a lot more content around mobile and just in general modern software and how that impacts your customers, your business, and your technology. So with that, we will sign off. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Morgan and Doc, and of course, Carol. Great job, great discussion.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.